Good morning, everyone. For those of you joining us from the East Coast, good afternoon. To our guest, Bill Browder, joining us from London. Welcome to this edition of the Doorstep Book Talks. I'm your co-host, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, Nick Gvosdev. And with me, as always,
I'm Tatiana Serafin, also co-host here at the Doorstep. Really excited today to welcome you, Mr. Browder. Thank you so much for coming. We're talking about freezing order today. Let's put it into view. It's a great book with so much to talk about today. We are going to start out the conversation, and I welcome all of you in our audience to put your questions in the chat. We will start that in about a half an hour, but we want to roll out with the news, and there is so much to talk about. Mr. Browder, you spent so much time in Russia, and then wrote your first book about your experience with corruption and under Putin. And this is your follow-up book, which then details the further trail and your further fight for justice and fight for survival. And I think I want to really highlight those two areas. The aspect of justice, which takes us around the world and into our doorstep, into the United States. So for our audience here in the United States, we like to talk about how global events are connected to our work here. And there's so much to talk about there. And also your fight for survival. I want to start out with a personal anecdote. I used to work at Forbes, and I was a colleague of Paul Klebnikov, who was murdered in Moscow. And so I understand your fears and your challenges as you fight for justice for your former lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. I also value what we call in the Orthodox faith, Vichnaya Pamyat, which is eternal memory. So we want to remember his name. And you write on page 207, quote, Putin wanted two things: the repeal of the original law and for Sergei Magnitsky's name never to be uttered again. And I think that his wish will never come true. His name will be uttered forever. And you have a decade and a half fighting for this. And we want to hear your story. And so I want to start with the question here with Putin kind of cornered. Do you feel vindicated? All of your efforts, do you feel like you're finally vindicated?
Well, I think vindicated is probably the wrong word. I spent, a decade screaming from the rooftops that Putin is a killer. He's a criminal. He means only harm to everybody he deals with. And I was so ignored and sidelined and marginalized by so many important people because there was such an interest in not coming to that realization. Everybody wanted the money, the Russian money that was sloshing around London and New York and Paris and Berlin. Everybody wanted Russian gas. And even if nobody wanted any of that stuff, they just didn't want any trouble with this guy who nobody really knew how to deal with. And so if anyone had ever, if the important decision makers, the powerful people in the world had listened to me, I think we might have avoided some of this heartbreaking mess that we're involved in right now. There have been so many instances where the West could have taken a much harder line on Putin, where the West could have imposed real sanctions the way we're doing right now before all this stuff happened. And had we done that, it might have had a real impact on Putin's calculations. Everyone says Putin miscalculated. I don't think he miscalculated. He was basing all of his decisions going into Ukraine and everything else on past experience. And his past experience was that the West was complicit, narrow-minded, business-focused, and never wanted to ever scream bloody murder when he started killing people. And so I would say that vindicated is not the right word at all. It's sort of heartbroken to watch the world going up in flames, that the Ukrainian women raped and children butchered, and just what we're seeing right now is so horrible, and so it's infuriating that and nobody's taking any responsibility for it. I mean, I go to these international conferences and listen to various national security advisors of various American presidents, and none of them will take any responsibility for giving Putin a pass for the last 22 years, and they all just say, "Oh well, it's a big surprise that all this happened." I don't think it's a surprise at all. If this is who he is, this is who he was, and we could have done something differently.
You were speaking about, past experience. When you said that, it reminded me once again of that dramatic footage from the Kremlin 2 days before the invasion, where Putin gathers the Russian establishment, and the thinking there is, the West will just learn to live with this as they've learned to live with Georgia and with everything else, and definitely something changed. Do you think, as you said, you've been shouting from the rooftops for all these years, but are you seeing a substantive change, and the work that you yourself have done in trying to change this focus? Do you think that we've reached a real turning point, or do you think that at some point we will slip back into, unfortunately, to use this phrase, business as usual with Russia? That there'll be some sort of ceasefire in Ukraine, and then sooner or later, the old habits, the money sloshing around, all of that comes back? Or do you think we've reached a turning point in this?
Well, I think that there's never going to be business as usual with Russia going forward. I think what Putin has done, the atrocities that he's committing in Ukraine, the violation of their territorial integrity, will not allow any type of business as usual. Having said that, let me just explain to you, or explain to your listeners, what Putin's objective is here. I mean, he can't win this war militarily. He has found himself in an effective military stalemate. The Ukrainians now have enough weapons and enough ambition and enough boots on the ground to prevent their country from being occupied by Russia. And so, but that's totally contingent on the West military and financial support of Ukraine. And so Putin is betting on not a military victory right now. He's betting that if he can keep the price of gas high, if he can make people shiver in Europe this winter, if he can prevent the export of wheat from Russia and Ukraine, and create a food and starvation crisis in Africa, which leads to a migration crisis in Europe, he's betting that may change the democracies that we live in the West. He's betting on populist leaders emerging from this, who will maybe at some point in time in the future, say completely different things than we're saying right now. If you look at who we have, running our countries right now, and I don't think, there's no change between Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. I don't think there'll be any change in the United States if Donald Trump is not reelected. I think any Republican would be the same as any Democrat. It's just if the only change would be Donald Trump. But somewhere along the line, there could be some fracture in this Western alliance based on populism, based on inflation, and based on refugees. And we don't know where that would be and how that would be and what it would mean. But that's what Putin's betting on right now.
And I'd like to tie that into your comment about enablers, right? Because that change, or that not change, comes because people enable this behavior. And I want to read from 293 in my book. As despicable as Putin's regime's behavior is, none of this can happen without the cooperation of Western enablers. Lawyers like John Mascow and Mark Simrat, spin doctors like Glenn Simpson, politicians like Dana Rohrabacher, executives like those at Danske Bank. These people, along with many others, lubricate the machine that allows Putin and his cronies to get away with their crimes. I want to detail this because this is part of the success, I feel, of your book, is this naming names. and showing the links of how we here in the United States, and you show the links in Europe too, have created systems, not only for money to flow undetected, but also for people to be corrupted. You point out, in your book, several, lobbyists and lawmakers here that literally, as you say on page 221, I was literally dodging Russians in the US government buildings on Capitol Hill. And I'd like for you to describe that scene for us, for our readers, because that was so vivid to me. Like, here is the bastion of democracy that now for me is corrupted by January 6th and by your description of what you were running from. Could you describe that scene and why to our readers?
So my main task since Sergei Magnitsky was killed was to get Magnitsky Act in place in the United States and all over the world. It started with the Magnitsky Act just for applying to Russia, but in 2016, the Magnitsky Act was going to be broadened to apply to the whole world, to Chinese human rights activists, human rights abusers, and to Myanmar and Iran and all those sorts of other places. And Putin really had a problem with this, not broadening it, but he had a problem with the name Magnitsky, as we discussed earlier. And so Putin employed a whole team of people through a Russian oligarch. So the Russian oligarch was paying the bills, and this Russian oligarch then paid the bills for Baker Hostetler, one of the major white shoe law firms of the United States that works for Microsoft and Ford Motor and so on and so forth, for Glenn Simpson in a firm called Fusion GPS that was also working on the Trump dossier at the time, on PR firms, on various other things, and they started running around Capitol Hill with Russian money funding an operation to try to convince lawmakers to take Sergei Magnitsky's name off of the Global Magnitsky Act. And in order to do that, they then claimed that Sergei Magnitsky wasn't murdered, that he died of natural causes, that it's all slander against the Russian penal system to say that he was murdered. They claimed that Sergei and I were financial criminals trying to cover up our own financial crime, and that Putin and his cronies were innocent of all those financial crimes. And they were running around the halls of Capitol Hill while this was all going on, unregistered, that they didn't register under the Foreign Agent Registration Act, which is in place to prevent this type of stuff from happening. And so effectively what you had was a Russian operation, a Russian intelligence operation in which subcontracted to U.S. citizens to go and pursue Putin's malicious policy objectives in Washington. And it was really just unbelievable for me that this was going on, and unbelievable at every step of the way that Americans would would sell themselves to the Russians, and that there was nobody standing in the way of making this happen. There was no FBI investigation. There was no Department of Justice, intervention. This was just going on in plain sight. Everybody knew it. Everyone was shocked by it, and nothing was happening. And you kind of think, if you're not involved in a situation like this, you kind of think that the system works. That that there are regulators and law enforcement and rules and so on and so forth. And what I discovered is that the entire system isn't fit for purpose. And it's not just in the United States. It's here in London, where I live, maybe more so here in London. Here we don't even have a Foreign Agent Registration Act. And here we also had literally members of the House of Lords, which is, I guess, the British equivalent of the US Senate, the upper chamber of Parliament, who were literally on the payroll of the Russian government, pursuing Russian government interests while they were serving in Parliament. And so these Western enablers are what, in many ways, lubricated the system for Putin, so that there were no reactions to Georgia when the invasion of Georgia. There was no reaction to the Crimea invasion, or no real reaction, I should say. No reaction against Russia per se. There was no reaction against the Salisbury Novichok poisonings. British people were busy going to the World Cup in Moscow shortly after they launched a chemical weapons attack using Novichok in a quiet British town. And so, yeah, the Russian Putin figured out that he didn't need to just employ the FSB, which is the KGB successor organization. He didn't need to employ the SVR, military foreign intelligence. He could bring in Americans and Brits to do his work, and there didn't seem to be any law or law enforcement stopping it.
And just to build on that, I mean, again, you present this, it's a classic case of influence peddling, of all the ways in which the system, the U.S. system certainly is permeable, regulate, the guardrails aren't there, or they're not enforced, and yet, just it doesn't seem that there's been any real substantive any attempt to change this. And it does also seem, and this goes back, Tatiana, to your point, and actually, to this point about global Magnitsky, is that people may say, I don't want Putin as a client, but I'm certainly open to lots of other people still that maybe don't have the spotlight on it. I mean, do you see any? I mean, was there a recognition? I mean, again, this very compelling incident. You're on the Hill. You're in the heart of American democracy. We've always understood that there's money. I mean, I'm not being naive about it. Mr. Smith going to Washington levels of naivete, but at the same time, I mean, there's real risks to national security and the question of national interests as well as our values being undermined. Did you get any sense? Again, Tatiana kind of asked the vindication question at the beginning, but coming back to that, I mean, is there even any belated movement now that what we've seen happen in Ukraine of any attempt to say we've got to plug these leaks, or is this just this was a terrible incident, but we're going to move on?
Well, so I mean, it's interesting. So on the question of Putin in Russia, everybody's pretending they never did anything.
Yeah.
There's this amazing professor from Yale, Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, who's been putting together these lists of who's in and who's out of Russia, and nobody wants to be on the list of who's still in, and it's been highly effective. And everybody's saying, we're out now. We never wanted to be in. It was very interesting. Right after the invasion, there was a British law firm that, like 2 days after the invasion, applied. I think it was VTB was sanctioned, and this British law firm applied for an exemption from the sanctions to represent them in some kind of legal debate that they were involved in. And I remember I started tweeting about it, and it got pretty viral. And a lot of people then, and some articles were then written about it. And like 2 days later, they like withdrew their representation for VTB Bank. And so I think that there's huge now, like commercial, public, consumer pressure for people not to be doing this type of work for the Russians. But there's no commercial public pressure for people not to do work for the Chinese government or for all sorts of other kleptocrats and dictators and evil regimes around the world. And so I don't think we've structurally solved the problem. It's now unfashionable to be doing anything connected to Putin because he's so obviously a monster, and everyone's finally figured it out. And you can watch these horrifying images on television. But no, the system hasn't been fixed at all, and nobody's borne any consequences from this. Nobody's in jail. Nobody has been impoverished. Nobody's had their lives ruined for this, for basically profiting off of an evil, murderous dictator. They've all just sort of slunk into the woodwork and hope that it all blows over, and then waiting for their time to reemerge doing some other profitable work for some other dictator.
I'm just struck by, again, from that scene, that it doesn't appear that anyone's DC privileges really have been revoked, and including some of the people you just mentioned now are still, no one. There's no shunning. There's no.
I was at the Aspen Security Forum, which is like the most august gathering of national security executives from the United States and other countries around the world, and from the media and everyone else. And Glenn Simpson, who was working for the Russians, trying to chase me and my colleagues down on behalf of the Russians and trying to smear us in Washington, was proudly walking around the Aspen Security Forum, shaking hands and slapping backs as if nothing had ever happened.
And trying to drum up more business.
Yep.
Speaking of that, you mentioned a lot of the bureaucracy that you dealt with. And one of the things that I think that is the great part of this book is that it could be a primer on how to make a bill, a law, or get an idea into passage, because you do actually take us through all of the people that you had to meet, how many times you had to go testify, and all of the work that you had to put in. And it wasn't an easy process. Was there anybody or anything that you feel worked? We want to try to be positive for our audience. Was there any part that worked? I want to bring up something that I think you highlighted that worked, but I want your
Well, I mean, a lot of things worked, and in fact, so I mean, if we sort of get away from the sausage making for a second and just look at the output of 12 years of advocacy on behalf of Sergei Magnitsky, there are now 34 countries in the world that have Magnitsky Acts in place. I mean, to get a law passed in the United States is like less probable than winning the lottery. And I mean, it really is almost impossible. I mean, there's so many cross currents to stop a piece of legislation from happening. And to get a piece of law passed in 34 countries is just inconceivable. And so it worked beyond anyone's wildest imaginations. And why did that work? It worked because there was a lot of amazing people in every place who cared about doing what was right. I mean, we've talked about the bad guys, but it's worth mentioning the good guys. And so, we have there's a character in my book, in this book and my previous book, named Kyle Parker. Kyle Parker was the chief of staff of the U.S. Helsinki Commission, which is the body in the U.S. Congress that deals with Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And he made it his life's work inside Congress to write the Magnitsky Act, to get the global Magnitsky Act in place, to run all the traps, and to work with some amazing senators who he worked for. Senator Benjamin Cardin, a Democrat from Maryland, Senator Roger Wicker, a Republican from Mississippi. And I should point out, by the way, that we're in a world of hyper partisanship, but there was no partisanship whatsoever when it came to the Magnitsky Act. The Magnitsky Act was it passed 92-4. And there's no difference whatsoever between Democrats and Republicans when it came to the Magnitsky Act. And so, just three names out of, and if you look at the back of my book, it's an extremely long acknowledgement section in every different country, because I name names of all the heroes of this story. The journalists who put themselves on the line to expose the money laundering and the corruption, the various politicians in all sorts of countries that in a world where nobody wanted them to be mentioning all this stuff about Russia that were out there, law enforcement in different places, all sorts of. I mean, there, I would say in a certain way, things in spite of all the obstacles that I was up against, we created a movement, a global international movement with literally probably more than 1,000 people who have played a role one way or another, who decided that what was going on in Russia and other places is wrong, and to freeze the assets and to ban the visas of those people who do that is the right way of going about it, and doing it, taking it upon themselves. I'm in debt to so many good-hearted people that took on this cause.
You mentioned journalists, so that was one of the highlights I wanted to pull out, not only because I'm a journalist myself, but also because we live in a time where journalism is attacked. Journalists are attacked. as you mentioned in the book too, the notion that fake news is all everywhere and you can't trust anything. And I think one of the highlights for me in your book was the fact that so many, from across the spectrum, you mentioned Richard Engel at MSNBC, reporters from the Wall Street Journal, Danish reporters. I mean, across the spectrum, there were many reporters that were sharing your story, that were digging into all of the pieces of the puzzle that you were putting together and shining that light. And also your work on Twitter, I thought was fascinating. So this idea that we're, maybe 30 years ago, this couldn't have happened because there's so much more access to information, so many more people taking the risks to get that information to where it needs to be. I'm thinking of the scene where you had the lawyer taking pictures of the documents, of the Russian documents, and, and all of those people that were then willing to travel and share the information with investigators here in the United States. But the importance of that outlet, that echo chamber of journalism and Twitter, I want to highlight, and with the story of how you tweeting in Spain helped you not to get arrested. Could you share with our readers that story? That is the first scene, but it was a great way to get into the book.
Yeah, so this was a really interesting part of what's been happening. So one of our biggest objectives, in addition to the Magnitsky Act, was to figure out who got the $230 million of corruption funds that Sergei Magnitsky exposed and was killed over. And for 12 years, I've had a team of people working with me to try to find that money. And when we find that money, what we do is we then write a criminal complaint to the law enforcement agency of the country where that money ended up in, and ask them to freeze that money, which is why the book is called Freezing Order. And we found most of the money. And one of the countries we found the money going to was Spain. We found money going to Spain, and it was used to buy luxury real estate on the coast of Spain for some members of the Russian government or their relatives. And so I wrote a criminal complaint to the chief anti-corruption prosecutor of Spain, who's a man named Jose Grinda. And he has a great reputation of going after a lot of really bad characters, Russian characters. And he responded positively to the criminal complaint. And under Spanish law, in order to initiate a criminal investigation, you have to go physically and present your evidence to the prosecutor and then sign a declaration as a victim. And so I was invited by him to go through this pretty much formalistic process to initiate the criminal investigation that he wanted to pursue. So I was invited to Madrid. This was May of 2018. I arrive in Madrid, check into a hotel in central Madrid. I got an amazing upgrade at the hotel. They gave me like the best suite in the hotel. I guess it was kind of empty at the time. And so I have a good sleep. I wake up the next morning. I open the door to go to breakfast, and standing outside the door is the manager of the hotel, the one who had given me the upgrade, and two uniformed Spanish police officers. And the manager was in mid-knock, and I open the door, and he very sort of sheepishly says, "Excuse me, Mr. Browder, I'm sorry to bother you, but these two gentlemen need to see your identification." So I pull out my passport, I hand it to one of the police officers. He's got a clipboard. He compares it to the name on the clipboard, and he says, "You're under arrest." And I say, "What for?" "Interpol, Russia." So at this point, the manager of the hotel starts to panic. He's not worried about me and being arrested. He's worried that his great suite that he upgraded me to is going to be sort of out of use because it's occupied with my stuff. And so he begs the officers to allow some time for me to pack my bags. They grudgingly agreed. And because it's a sort of series of rooms, I go to one of the rooms where they can't see me, and I call my wife. She's not picking up the phone. I call the lawyer who had organized the meeting with the prosecutor, my Spanish lawyer. He's not picking up the phone. And my wife had always told me, if you ever encounter a situation like this and you can't get hold of anyone, put it on Twitter. So I type into Twitter, "Urgent, being arrested in Madrid, Spain right now on a Russian warrant," and I press send. So at least somebody knew about it. So I then grab my stuff, pack my bags, go down to the police car, and they throw me into the back of the police car, and I'm sitting in this police car, and it's like any other police car, I guess. It's my first time in the back of a police car. You can't roll down the windows, you can't open the doors. There's thick plexiglass between me and the guys in front. And I had this terrible realization that maybe these guys weren't actually police officers. I mean, how hard is it to get a uniform and maybe steal a police car? And I thought, I wonder if people really believed my tweet, because maybe my account had been hacked, or there was no real way of verifying it. And to add sort of more mystery to the whole situation, these guys didn't pat me down or take away my phones or anything, which I thought would be the kind of thing that a policeman would do if they're arresting someone. But because they hadn't taken away my phones, I had an opportunity to take a picture surreptitiously of the back of their heads, and all the paraphernalia on the dashboard. And I took the picture, and they didn't see me taking it. And then I tweeted out, in the back of the police car on the way to the station. I pressed send. And at this point, all the journalists who were sort of all trying to figure out what to do about this thing now had some like real verification that I was in the back of the police car. And all of a sudden, my phone was on silent, but all these news alerts started coming up. Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, New York Times. Browder arrested in Madrid. And then all the people that were watching Twitter, it was now going viral. Journalists were then starting to call Interpol in Lyon, France. They were starting to call the French Interior Ministry. I'm a citizen of Great Britain. They started calling the British government, and in the dozens, probably hundreds. So everyone was trying to figure out what was going on. And by the time I get to the police station, they probably had gotten like 50 calls, and an hour and a half later, the chief of police came in and said, "We've just received notice from Interpol that the warrant is no longer valid. You're free to go." Now, Twitter, everyone's talking about how Twitter is a force of evil, but in my case, it certainly got me out of a really nasty scrape. And if I had to go through the normal channels, if like my lawyer, applying to the judge and the judge rejecting it, and then the Russians have 45 days to issue my extradition papers, and I have 30 days to respond, and they have 30 days. This thing could have gone on for months and months. In the meantime, they're freezing my assets around the world, trying to arrest my colleagues, and just completely, it could have ended up really badly. And so this was like a true sort of, Twitter disrupted the process of law enforcement to make the Spanish and Interpol realize the unbelievable, disgusting mess that they waltzed into. And by the way, it's really interesting, as just a total aside, that we all read the papers and all this stuff. Police, they don't Google anybody's name. They just go, and if there's a warrant, they go and arrest the person. And it became very clear to them very quickly that people probably lose their job if they didn't let me go at that moment in time.
Well, and that also points to a phenomenon we've talked about, enablers, but also the way in which Western legal systems can be weaponized by people from the outside. That this was using the Interpol process, which is meant to go after actual criminals, but if filing the right paperwork and pushing the right buttons to create this scenario. And again, as you said, I mean, these the two Spanish police officers sent to arrest you, they're not independently verifying, or they're not Googling and seeing what's going on. They're just, they're following a procedure. But again, I think that speaks to work that you've been doing and others about, what we call lawfare, about, strengthening our institutions so that they can't be as easily perverted by taking advantage of the process. In this case, filing a notice through Interpol and then having Spanish law enforcement just automatically respond, because that's just the way Interpol notices are treated. So, but again, and also your point too about were these legitimate police? And I think now increasingly those are I don't think that was a in looking at that incident, reading it, I don't think that was necessarily a paranoid or incorrect assessment that you had to weigh that as a possibility, especially these days, as we've seen. One thing, also, just kind of turning it back, though, to jump on, using the thing about freezing orders. Obviously, since February 24th, we've seen a lot of assets frozen, yachts, real estate, bank accounts. Again, is this a better late than never, where finally, the trails of dark money and the use of shell companies and third-party intermediaries to acquire property and assets in the West, we're finally going after? Or again, is this sort of episodic, and that, maybe a specific Russian oligarch loses a yacht, but the system that allowed him or her to get the yacht in the first place isn't really going to be tampered with?
I'm afraid to say that I don't see any structural changes to how all this stuff works. I mean, yes, now we're all sort of waking up to the fact that money laundering is connected to blood, violence, and death, which I knew. I tried to explain to other people; they didn't want to think about it. But it's one thing to set up. The U.S. has been very good about it. They set up the Klepto Capture Task Force. And they're going after certain oligarchs. But that's just, that's sort of, as you say, episodic in the sense that, I think all countries should have total transparency about ownership, because then you don't need a klepto capture task force from the Department of Justice. Everybody can see who owns what, and if a government official owns something, then why do they own some big villa in the center of London, kind of thing? And we don't have that. And here in the UK, I should point out that there has not been a single economic crimes prosecution against a Russian in 22 years since Putin came to power. And London is the major hub of money laundering. $1 trillion has been laundered out of Russia since Putin came to power, and they've not done one single prosecution. And that tells me that major structural reforms need to happen here in the United States and elsewhere. Because it's one thing to pick a few emblematic cases to sort of make a point, but it's another thing to create a system where it's hostile to money laundering. And for that matter, one of the big targets of my book, and name that I name, is Danske Bank. Danske Bank is Denmark's largest bank. And Danske Bank was responsible for laundering the money from the Magnitsky case, and it was responsible for laundering $230 billion of Russian money, dirty money that came out of Russia. And not a single person has gone to jail, as far as I'm aware, from Danske Bank. And if Danske Bank people aren't going to jail, then other people who have laundered less money are probably even less likely to go to jail. And so it's, people need to understand that if you do this kind of stuff, you should go to jail. And if they don't, when they're starting to do this same type of money laundering for some other, dictatorship or evil regime, the profits outweigh the costs or the risks.
Yeah.
I'd like to pivot a little bit to the questions coming in from the chat, if we can. I'd love to continue the money laundering talk, but let's pivot to some questions, specifically because if we're going back to the comments of what you went through with Interpol in 2018, there was also a point where you went through, you were in the U.S. and Trump and Putin met in Helsinki, and so I'm going to ask part A, that kind of what happened there with this question from the audience. Do you agree with McCarthy's comment that Trump was on Putin's payroll? Did Putin bail out Trump through Deutsche Bank when no one else would lend him money?
Well, so let me tell the Helsinki story very quickly first. So in July of 2018, Trump and Putin met in Helsinki at the Helsinki summit. It was on a Monday, and the previous Friday, Robert Mueller, the special counsel investigating Russian interference in the U.S. political process, indicted 12 Russian military intelligence officers for hacking the election. And so the obvious question at the summit was whether Putin was going to hand over these 12 military intelligence officers. And when he was asked that question by a Reuters journalist, he kind of smiled, having clearly been preparing for it all weekend before the summit and said, yes, it's entirely possible that we can hand over these officers, but we would expect some reciprocity from America. And specifically, we'd like Bill Browder, me. And so that's pretty upsetting to hear, of the 7+ billion people in the world, I'm the one person being mentioned at the summit. But it wasn't surprising because Putin had been chasing me for years. I've been put on Interpol 8 times. They'd twice prosecuted me and sentenced me to 18 years in absentia. And he's been bringing my name up everywhere all the time. But what the question was, what was Trump going to do about this? And so another journalist says to Trump, what do you think? And he says, I think it's an incredible offer. And so that was really horrifying for me, because I was actually in the US at the time. And I thought, I could easily picture, 4 blacked out SUVs like converging on my home and coming in and grabbing me and putting a bag over my head and waking up in a Moscow prison. So that really was upsetting. And by the way, it took Trump 4 days to walk it back, and a Senate vote 98-0 not to hand me over before that whole thing went away. So the obvious question is why is Trump getting along with Putin so well? And I've got my own theories about Trump. First of all, I don't think there's all this stuff about that they have compromise on him, compromising material. And what we've learned about Trump is that nothing compromises him. He's uncompromisable. He's unblackmailable. There doesn't seem to be anything that he does. As he said, he can shoot someone on Fifth Avenue. I also don't believe this theory that Trump was lent money by Russians, and therefore he was beholden to them, because Trump has been lent money by almost every financial institution in the United States and defaulted on them, and he didn't feel accountable to them. So why should he feel accountable to some no-name Russians? My theory on Trump is that he's like a maitre d' at a fancy restaurant, and a high roller walks in, and all of a sudden he clears out a table meant for somebody else because he wants to get a big tip at the end of the meal. And so Trump loves Mohammed bin Salman, loves Putin, loves Xi, because they're all high rollers. Potentially, something good can come financially to him at some point in time. And that's just how he operates.
I'll leave that at that and go to, Trump was one of the big purveyors of this idea of fake news. And so I want to turn to a question about misinformation, especially against you. So we're talking about the physical threats against you, but there's also this credibility threats against you, which I think are also important, because that has to do with, your personhood, your name. The importance of your name. I was particularly struck by the movie that was made and shown at the museum. And as a First Amendment advocate, that part of your story was shocking to me. So could you share that story and what happened after, and how you're protecting your name?
So as I mentioned, the Russians were running in 2016, were running around Washington trying to keep Magnitsky's name off the Global Magnitsky Act. And one of the ways that they wanted to achieve that goal was to say that Magnitsky was a crook, and that Bill Browder was a crook and totally a liar for telling the whole Magnitsky story. And in order to sort of buttress this lobbying campaign that they did, the Russians got a movie made by a relatively well-known documentarian who had done previously anti-Putin movies. So they got this guy, his name is Andrei Nekrasov, to do a movie about me, where the premise of the movie was that I just made up the whole Magnitsky story, that it's just a lie from top to bottom, that Sergei Magnitsky wasn't a whistleblower, that he wasn't murdered, that he was a financial criminal, and that the whole purpose of the Magnitsky story was just to shield my financial crimes and to defame the Putin regime. That was and he was not a bad filmmaker in the sense that it was all very high production value, and it also, if you didn't know any facts that contradicted it, if you're just like coming in cold and watching it, you'd think, well, something is wrong here. And so he started going around the world trying to show this in various parliaments where the Magnitsky Act was being debated. And he tried showing it in the European Parliament. And the European Parliament, after we sent legal letters saying, that you're basically lying from top to bottom and everyone involved in this is going to have problems, they decided not to show it in the European Parliament or on French, German, Finnish, and other national television stations. Anyways, they get to the United States, and they came up with a beautiful idea. And I have to hand it to them. You have to compliment your adversaries when they deserve it. They called up the Newseum, which is the Museum of Free Speech, and booked a room to show the movie at the Newseum. And so we wrote to the Newseum and said this movie is full of lies, and and Sergei Magnitsky's mother wrote to the museum saying don't show this movie, and they got their back got up by everybody trying to tell them not to show this movie, and so they became a defender of a Russian propaganda film because they were the Museum of Free Speech, and I probably shouldn't have been so concerned about this movie in the first place, because when they finally showed it, it was so shocking and upsetting and angering to the people who were in the audience that they kind of did the work for me of basically discrediting it. And when it, the next day the reviews came out in the Washington Post saying Russian propaganda fails in Washington and other things like that. But it was remarkable to me, how much money was invested in this whole operation. I mean, to make a major documentary movie was not a cheap endeavor, and to hire US PR firms to go and lobby it and rent rooms and do all this kind of stuff. It was a big endeavor for them to try to, and the purpose of this was to try to defame me, to try to ruin my credibility, so that, and they didn't have to prove that I was somehow bad. All they have to do is just plant a seed of doubt. And then people, and particularly in the lawmaking process, people say, it's too complicated. I don't know who's right, who's wrong. We don't want to get involved. And that was their intention. And we fought back hard, and we fought back successfully, and it didn't work. But and I'm pretty good at fighting back. But if this had happened to someone who wasn't sort of battle scarred from years and years of fighting with these people, it could have easily succeeded.
And so I'll go to a question as we're, coming to our last 10 minutes. I encourage our audience to send in questions. What is next for you? Are there, where are you pursuing new acts in new countries? Do you have new targets? Are you moving on to closing the money laundering loopholes? Where are you going next?
Yes, and yes. So in order for the Magnitsky Act to truly work, we've got to close off the access to all rule of law, property rights, civilized countries to dirty money. And so we have the European Union, we have the United States, so 27 countries in the European Union, the United States, Canada, the UK, Australia, but there's still a few countries that are sort of safe places to keep your money. So Japan doesn't have a Magnitsky Act. They should. New Zealand, amazingly, doesn't have a Magnitsky Act. They should. I think South Korea to a lesser extent. And Switzerland doesn't have a Magnitsky Act. We're working hard on them. I mean, that's a real tough nut to crack, the Swiss. And so I'm kind of going through, and then also within Europe, the European Union has a Magnitsky Act, but it requires unanimity of all EU countries. And there's a bunch of corrupt ones like Hungary that are working on behalf of Putin. And so I'm working on individual Magnitsky Acts in EU member states. And for example, the Czech Republic now has draft legislation that's been sponsored by the foreign minister there, who we think it's going to happen soon. And I'm kind of hoping to get a lot of individual EU member states to do it themselves, so that we can sort of plug the loopholes if Orban from Hungary or one of these other not so great European leaders tries to veto sanctions. So that's one of the big projects. The second big project is to make sure that the Magnitsky Acts are used properly. So governments generally don't like to sanction people, but sanctioning people for human rights abuse is kind of a no-brainer, and it doesn't necessarily you can still do diplomacy and sanction people in the same time, and we've seen that with Russia. I mean, the people before Putin invaded, back in the days, when plenty of secretaries of state were talking to Lavrov while we were sanctioning their people. And I think that can happen with China and other places.
Yeah.
My hope is that instead of having 500 some odd people on the U.S. global Magnitsky list, that there's like 20,000, and it becomes like a high probability event that if you're a dictator doing terrible things to your people, that you're going to end up becoming persona non grata in the world financial system. If that's the case, then we've really created a very strong countermeasure to human rights abuse and kleptocracy.
How can we get a younger generation more involved in this? And I'm kind of asking for advice from my students too. But a lot of the characters in your book are seasoned. I'll use the word seasoned. But how do we get younger people involved and caring when there is so much to care about in the world and so many other things going on? How do you grab their attention? How can we kind of continue this to the next generation? Because I think that's also what it's going to take.
Well, it's a great question. And so, I get invited a lot to give speeches about my experience and my book and so on. And I always accept the invitations to go to schools and universities, because it's just so important to do exactly what you said, which is to touch the next set of leaders of the world, the people, the future leaders of the world. And so, it's part of a long process, which is to sensitize people that dictatorship, we in the United States and in the UK and in Europe, we live really charmed lives. We're allowed to say what we think, and we're allowed to vote, and we're allowed to criticize the government. But most of the world doesn't live that way, and most people don't really understand how pernicious that is, and how horrible it is for people who live in countries where you really have no say in anything. And the more people can understand that, the more people will, not buy, look at the labels on their, clothes, not buy clothes made in China if the Chinese government is doing this type of stuff. And for that, everybody needs to understand that this is, these countries, there's a lot of countries out there doing a lot of terrible things to their citizens, and we shouldn't tolerate it. It should not be acceptable. And part of that comes from education. Part of that comes from our leaders. Part of it, if our leaders excuse the behavior of Chinese or the Iranian or whatever regimes, or put up with it or tolerate it, then why would other people do differently? And so I think it's a much longer question, a much longer answer than we could handle in the last 10 minutes of this conversation. But it's all about allowing it to go on. I mean, people, if you put up barriers to bad behavior, if you create consequences for bad behavior, people tend to behave less badly.
Is there a role to kind of globalize this even further? We spent a lot of time talking about the West, which, as you say, is a little bit charmed, but we have entire continents that we didn't just discuss today. And I know we only have a few minutes left, but is there a role? I'm going to bring it back to the United Nations, because I'm sitting here in New York, and we have the GA coming in, causing traffic and other things. But is there a role that we can take at a multinational level with a multinational institution, do you think, to kind of bring it all together?
Well, the United Nations, the creation of the United Nations was like the wonderful sort of great idea, and it's been so bastardized that the United Nations is the last place to do this type of thing. I mean, here we are looking at a possible nuclear catastrophe at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant in Ukraine, and you have the Russians have a veto, so that the United Nations really can't do anything. I mean, anything, they can't even issue a statement about it. You have Saudi Arabia and Somalia and all sorts of other countries on the UN Human Rights Council. I mean, it's the United Nations is no longer fit for purpose, and so there's probably some new gathering of the coalition of the willing of rule of law democracies who could get together and throw, put pressure and create values. But the United Nations definitely doesn't fall into that, and it's a sad verdict, because the United Nations was set up with such a noble mission at the very beginning.
There was a question here, and it's a kind of a big question, but it refers back to the beginning of our conversation. So I think it's a nice way to round it out. Any advice on what we can do to maintain institutions in our democracies to prevent becoming a kleptocracy?
Well, everybody was so worried about America going the wrong way during the Trump era, and that he was chiseling away at all these institutions, and he was trying, certainly. But when I was hearing all this, I was saying to myself, no journalists have been arrested in the United States for criticizing the government. No politicians have been put in jail for having a contrary position to the administration. The courts, no judge. The judges. You may have judges' decisions you don't agree with, but the courts weren't being bribed or usurped or in any way. And the American people ended up voting and replacing one leader with another. Maybe it wasn't a smooth transition of power, but it wasn't completely peaceful, but it wasn't. And so I would say that yes, there were some real attempts being made to sort of weaken institutions, but it's nothing like I've seen in Russia or any other country. And I think that America is very robust. Here in the UK, 2 days ago, we had Boris Johnson submitting his resignation and Liz Truss showing up. There was no problem. It all looks very fractious and annoying, and people say lots of things that we don't agree with and so on. But we are so privileged, and the institutions pretty much work. And yes, that there are people who don't want them to work, but I'm not nearly as pessimistic about the U.S. Sort of falling apart and becoming a dictatorship in the way that people are saying, because I've not seen there was a challenge, and the institutions stood up to the challenge.
I would like to leave off on that positive note. And I want to remind our audience, the book that we're talking about today is Freezing Order, A True Story of Money Laundering, Murder, and Surviving Vladimir Putin's Wrath, by Bill Browder. Is an amazing book. I really enjoyed it, obviously. And I look forward to your next one and our next book talk.
Well, I hope I don't have enough material for another book, but we'll see. But thank you very much for a great conversation, and really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.